in eras where the world cuts itself off from each other, then we just get less science. It's really a cutting our nose to spite our face kind of situation where we will all lose, but the Chinese won't lose especially. We will lose just as much.
My name is Scott Moore, practice professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, and a proud participant in several National Committee on U.S. China Relations programs. So I'm particularly delighted to be here today on behalf of the National Committee with Deborah Seligsohn, assistant professor of political science at Villanova University, and Yasheng Huang, Epoch Foundation professor of international management at the Sloan School of Management at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, about current U.S. China scientific collaboration, the legacy of the U.S. China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, or STA, and the potential future of an STA 2.0. Deb and Yasheng, thank you so much for being with us. I'd love to begin this conversation by asking a couple of questions about historical context. First of all, talking about how the STA began. And here I might turn first to Deb in recognition of your expertise with the agreement, not just from your own research and academic experience, but your experience working as a science counselor at U.S. Embassy Beijing and really helping to implement this agreement.
So the U.S. China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement was the first agreement signed after normalization of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China in 1979. It was signed directly by President Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping. So it has always formed part of the bedrock of the relationship. And the idea of scientific cooperation was core to what both countries were looking for in 1979. Both countries saw it as a key to economic development and flourishing for both countries. The agreement was signed, it was ratified by the Senate, 2/3 vote, all of that, and it gets renewed every 5 years. Under the agreement are almost 100 sub-agreements, protocols, annexes, etc., between U.S. and Chinese government agencies. And these are the core of where the work has been done. So the agreement forms the framework, and every single one of these other agreements refers back to that agreement as the framework. So as a legal structure, it's really important. The Chinese also see it as the core to all scientific relationships between the U.S. and China. There's language in the agreement about universities, think tanks, business, etc. While the United States government does not see any of that as necessary for a university or a think tank, the Chinese government does. And so for the bilateral scientific cooperation, which is the deepest and most extensive between any two countries anywhere in the world for all of human history, this agreement is core.
Thanks so much. And maybe one follow-up question for you, Deb, before turning to Professor Huang. What did the typical 5-year review process of the STA look like? In other words, after that initial kind of genesis, what have we seen in terms of the periodic renewal since then?
So sometimes it was just renewed. Sometimes there was added language. And the last 2 renewals have involved extensive upgrading of intellectual property protection language. So that it now is actually really tough on intellectual property. And I honestly don't think there's much more that could be done in that area. And that's been the biggest area of change, because most of the other areas of change just involve adding new protocols, new annexes, letting old annexes that aren't needed anymore expire, rather than changing the fundamental agreement. But the IP stuff has really changed over the years. Nobody was even thinking about it in 1979, if you can believe that.
Thank you, Professor Seligsohn, for that. And as promised, I wanted to now turn to Professor Huang with kind of one more historical question, really relating to the early part of this 21st century, where many consider the 2000s a period where U.S. China science and technology activity probably reached an all-time high. And I'd be curious to get your sense, Professor Huang, of what role the STA played in that period in terms of U.S. China scientific technological collaboration.
Thank you, Scott. I really defer to Deborah on the specifics, the historical backgrounds of the STA. She was involved in the many of the implementation details of the agreement. But I think it's important to just point out that the U.S.-China relationships in science, technology, and education were governed by a framework that provided not necessarily the specific projects and specific areas of collaborations, but provided the framework that guided many of the collaborative projects that have very productively and beneficial for the humankind, right? Because this is research in basic science and fundamental research. So it's very important that we have the framework to guide the research, the collaborations. And the fear now is that given the state of U.S.-China relations, whether or not we can continue to operate under some sort of framework.
Thank you. And one more kind of question that bridges both the historical context and then getting to why the STA is kind of currently in the news, at least when it comes to U.S.-China relations. And I'd be really curious to ask you both, maybe starting with Professor Seligsohn, what happened in recent years that's put the agreement at risk of lapsing, particularly since, Professor Seligsohn, as you mentioned, we've seen this agreement renewed a number of times. So what's different about our current moment?
So let me go back to the flourishing period a bit to give you a little more on what actually was going on in the early 2000s. We had just enormous new projects and agreements in areas such as public health, where we had a robust HIV/AIDS program. We had an emerging infectious disease program in the wake of SARS and H5N1 in the early 2000s. We really upgraded our energy cooperation even during the Bush administration, and then that led to massive climate cooperation during the Obama administration, including the Clean Energy Research Centers, which were a super ambitious public-private partnership on a scale not really seen in international cooperation before. So there was a ton of work done, and this was all work done under the agreement, while academic researchers and others were also really increasing the amount of just plain quality science between the two countries. And as I say, that wasn't really under the agreement from a U.S. point of view, but it was from a Chinese point of view. So what happened? Several things. I think the larger story is just the international context of greater friction between the U.S. and China, just national security friction. Often when Americans, especially in Washington, and especially people who aren't particularly technically savvy, which describes most of the foreign policy establishment, look at China and see Chinese excellence, they just seem to assume it was stolen, instead of the fact that Chinese students coming to the US, to Europe, to Australia, to Japan for the last 40 years have achieved a great deal of knowledge, which they've then gone home and trained their students with, and that China is really a scientific powerhouse. So if you really look, if you talk to any IP expert, the real major theft of IP was back in the 90s. And most theft of IP today in China is one Chinese company against another rather than international. But there's this suspicion in Washington that if we see something great, it must be because it was stolen. And Occasionally that can be true, but it isn't the majority of the story. And then there were, I think, inflated expectations of what the Chinese could do. My example that really gets me every time is the US and China cooperated together in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And the US asked the Chinese to build an emergency hospital, which it took the Chinese a couple of months to build. And US officials were like, I don't get it. They built one in 1 week during SARS. And I'm like, yeah, but that was in the suburbs of Beijing, and they live in Beijing. They aren't actually the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're not used to shipping stuff halfway around the world to build an emergency hospital. And so there were expectations, and there are many others where people just were like, oh, wait, they don't quite do what we want. And in that sense, also, there was this idea that the US would always be calling the shots, that we would always be the big brother. And sometimes the Chinese just want to do what they want to do. And so I think there were, as China became more comfortable and powerful and comfortable with its power, even beyond the places where that power actually ran into each other, such as the South China Sea, there just was a lot more friction going on that has bled into this relationship.
So, Professor Seligsohn, you kind of started to get, I think, to why the STA is really significant for the U.S. and China. But the U.S. also has dozens of similar bilateral agreements with other countries. What it kind of makes this one different, or is it really just the scale of collaboration between the U.S. and China that the STA governs?
So not only do we have, more than 60, the Chinese do as well. So this is something countries do. What makes it different is in every other country in the world, the STA is just about government to government cooperation. And nobody at Oxford, when working with someone at Berkeley, thinks that they're doing something under an STA. Whereas between the US and China, it has this umbrella aspect where the Chinese see, and there's language in the agreement that says that it covers all cooperation between the two countries. So losing it risks a great deal more. The other huge difference is just how important these two countries are to science, right? These are the two global leading science powers. The US and China today are actually peers in science. And what makes it so important for the US is the reason we have been the leader for all these years is because we are the most open. We are where people want to come. We become the center of a network of science. And if we cut off the relationship between the US and China, we really risk our centrality in the global scientific network. I don't think what happens is that China takes our place. China is still not a place where people from all over the world actually want to come make their home and do science for years and years, even though they want to do projects and they want to go back and forth and whatnot. And so I think what you actually would get is a splintering of global science, a sort of disturbance of the network that would make the era that we're heading into less scientifically potent than the era we come from. In eras where the world cuts itself off from each other, then we just get less science. And I think it's really a cutting our nose to spite our face kind of situation where we will all lose. But the Chinese won't lose especially. We will lose just as much.
I think that's a very important point. I want to sort of, and Professor Seligsohn, you already kind of addressed the intellectual property argument, but I want to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit and ask you both, and maybe turn in first to Professor Huang, for this, with the kind of caveats that Professor Seligsohn mentioned in mind. Is there any truth to the concern that the STA kind of no longer serves U.S. interests, in part because of intellectual property theft on the Chinese side? And on a related note, is there any advantage to seeing the STA, the U.S. China STA, lapse? So Professor Huang, I'll turn to you first, and then Professor Seligsohn.
Yeah, so much of the IP concern about China, criticism of China, if you look at some of these specific allegations carefully, they're really about the corporate sector, the behavior of the companies. And it's really not a academic sector issue. And academics publish their research, and there's really very little IP immediately with the academic research. And as Deborah pointed out, one of the most substantial part of the collaboration between China and the US is in the domain of public health, right? So it's hard to argue that the IP itself is so important that we have to cut out collaborations with China or with another country. All these have very heavy public goods nature and characteristics to them. And the STA, I mean, if you actually, let's just say, accept for the sake of the argument that IP is a concern, what you want to do is to structure the agreement and to have, to work provisions and cautions and safeguards into the agreement rather than not renewing the agreement, right? So that ought to be the right way to go about it rather than not renewing the STA at all. As Deborah pointed out, in the later revisions of the STA, there were IP provisions that were worked into the agreement. How effective they are, I don't really know. But at least the agreement provides a way to at least begin to address the IP issue. But I really believe that the bigger factor is the geopolitics and the role of the technology that plays into the geopolitical conflicts and competition between the two countries. Most politicians don't make a distinction between technology and science, right? So they think that it's the same thing. And whereas, you can make an argument that they are not the same thing, and they're different from each other. But I have to say that under Xi Jinping, the discussion in China is also increasingly focusing on linking technology with military modernization. There is a new organization in Chinese political system, the Civil and Military Fusion Commission, chaired by Xi Jinping. So there's a sort of an explicit effort to link technology with the military. I don't know how effective that is, and I don't even know whether or not you need to have that commission to link technology with military modernization. But the signal and the message that establishment of the commission sent out is that Chinese are taking technology very, very seriously, and there's a military and geopolitical agenda behind it, right? So that has raised the fear on the part of the policymakers in Washington, D.C. about whether or not we should continue collaborations with China. So I really believe that there is, so the STA is both a cause for good relationship between US and China, but fundamentally it is a result of a good and trust between the two countries. And to the extent we don't have that now, STA is a casualty of that lost trust between the two countries.
Professor Seligsohn, any good reason why we would want to see the STA lapse?
I honestly don't think so. I think that if there are areas that we view as too risky, we can not have sub-agreements in those areas. There's no particular reason to use another cliche to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the agreement doesn't say what you have to do. It just says we can do all these things, and we have plenty of choices under them. As Professor Huang says, public health has been one big area. The other big area has been energy, where an awful lot of it is about policy. But, how how the IP situation works is it's about IP generated under the agreement. So this says a lot of this was under the Clean Energy Research Centers, which did have this public-private partnership and did work on sort of good energy technologies in areas like carbon capture and storage, electric vehicles, and energy efficient buildings, etc. And this is stuff where the companies involved have been perfectly happy. There really haven't been a lot of disputes under that agreement. I mean, the most outrageous IP theft, it wasn't even theft, goes all the way back to the 1990s when Hughes and Loral gave technology that they weren't supposed to give to the Chinese, which goes back to its companies. And the problem is companies have an interest in sharing technologies that make their business work better. And sometimes those violate export controls. And that's what happened in that case. And both of them faced prosecution and massive fines. So it's not like the US hasn't responded in the past when people violate. And if there's specific defense-related technologies, there are export control rules that apply to those. And in fact, over the last several years, the Biden administration has massively increased the number and type of export control rules that not only businesses, but even Chinese universities, universities with Chinese scholars, etc., face. I mean, in many cases, I think it's gone overboard. But the reality is we have these other tools, and the STA is just the wrong tool for this particular question. And I'd note on the civil military fusion is they've always had that. I mean, I used to go to Costend all the time, which is essentially the military technology. And why did I go over to the Costend building? It's because it's where their civilian space and civilian nuclear energy authorities were housed. It was certainly in those days a total fiction that they were separate, and nobody took that seriously on any side. So and of course we have lots too. I mean, our aviation is for both civilian and military purposes, et cetera, et cetera. So none of this is surprising. And I think the real challenge is that we have to learn how to work with a peer country. And it's hard, and it's going to have to be very, very different than the way the US approached the Soviet Union, which was a peer militarily, but not economically, and where we had very little economic integration. So I don't think the new Cold War framework is a useful framework. And the most interesting framework is the way Great Britain dealt with the rising power of the United States. And the question is, given totally different governance models, whether something like a friendly rise is possible. And I really hope it is, because the cost of war is just unimaginable.
I can't resist a really brief editorial comment on that. I think you both, brought up this really interesting issue of civil military fusion. I think it's absolutely correct that that dates to the early years of the People's Republic. And I would also add that when it was adopted, it was not seen as a particularly advantageous strategy. It was a reflection of limited resources, and it was sort of an expedient that had to be followed. Something that I think we totally lost sight of in the contemporary discussion. We're almost out of time, but I want to just turn to you both for a very brief closing kind of comment, maybe 10 seconds or so. So you, I think, convinced me, and I think hopefully all of our listeners, that we should not let the STA lapse. Is there anything we should change in a renewed STA?
I don't think it's the right approach on our part not to take national security concerns seriously, right? You cannot just look at the routine civil military collaboration as a routine matter. The simple fact is that it was a national commission chaired by Xi Jinping himself, and it took place in this era of rising geopolitical tensions in South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. So we cannot only look at this issue as an isolated issue apart from other issues. I completely agree with Deborah that STA is the wrong tool to use to address that issue. So we need to keep these two things separate. And there is legitimate national security concern, but this is not really the right tool. And also, as Deborah pointed out, there are export controls put in place. There's nothing in the STA that says that you do not observe other laws and regulations when you carry out STA, right? STA has to be implemented in compliance with other rules and other regulations. But the larger tendency in the past has been separating fundamental research from applied technology. What is being lost today in Washington, D.C. is that line between fundamental research, public-facing, public-benefiting research, fundamental science, and applied technology. That has been completely lost in the discussions today.
Thank you. Professor Seligsohn?
So I would like to see two things, one of which I think is very easy and the other maybe. So the easy one is, I think, a line that the agreement is for peaceful purposes needs to be added. Believe it or not, the 80s were a very different time. And actually, we were interested in working with the Chinese and opposing the Soviet Union. So that wasn't part of the original agreement, but we are in a very different world. And I think that is a minor way to address the military issue. The bigger way is export controls and that kind of thing, and all the other things we do on the international front. But I think we need to add that. The more difficult thing is I would like to see some language clarifying data sharing and data openness. There are two kinds of issues that I'd like to see addressed. One is just data availability. There have been a bunch of databases in China that have become more difficult to access over the last couple of years, and making it clear that databases that are public in China should be public internationally ought to be a relatively simple thing. And of course, you can make it reciprocal, databases that are available publicly in the United States. And, you know, I see papers all the time where Chinese are using NASA data, so they are using it. The second thing on the data front is about the 2018 data law, and just making it clear that researchers that work together and generate data together can share that data, because that's a little murky under that law. I saw some draft clarifications about a year ago, and I really don't know whether they've gone into final. And I'd like to see those in the agreement if at all possible. But I don't think it's worth selling out, destroying the agreement even for that, because the cost would be even larger.
Yeah, Deborah, let me just add, I believe there are some clarifications, additional provisions along some of the lines that you have suggested. And I think the two sides apparently are closer with each other than we thought. And the other change is that the two sides are now trying to narrow down the areas of collaborations and sort of specifying scope rather than leaving the issue as completely open-ended.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you both very much for this really timely discussion about STA and for sharing your insights on the future of U.S.-China collaboration in science and technology. I also want to thank the National Committee staff who behind the scenes made this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope you will return for future National Committee programs. Thank you to you all.